Okay, so who is this guy fustel coulanges I keep talking about? And why would anybody care? Well, he was born in 1830 and died in 1889. He was educated at the École Normale Supérieure and the French school at Athens. By profession, he was a teacher, a professor. Chronologically, he taught at the University of Strasbourg, the École Normale Supérieure, the University of Paris, the Sorbonne, and he ended his career as the director of the École Normale Supérieure, being appointed in 1880. Why is he significant? Basically, because of one book, in my opinion, and who he taught. This is the actual book, The Ancient City by Fustel de Coulanges. A study on the religion, laws, and institutions of Greece and Rome. Translated by Willard Small, 12th edition. This is the 1901 version. I think there were other ones. As a result of that particular work, he can easily be considered the grandfather of really three different fields of study that are familiar to us. One would be postmodernist history, although I don't think any historians like to refer to it that way. Let's call it non-narrative history. That's what they tend to call it, which is a focus not on the great men, as history had been up to that time, but on the more niggling details of history, rather than trying to put things into a chronological order. Things like the economy and ecology and what have you. Less directly, he could be considered an anthropologist, in fact. Having studied at the French School of Athens, you would have to call him an anthropologist of the sort, particularly a cultural anthropologist. And he could also be considered the grandfather of sociology, because one of his more prominent students was Emile Durkheim, who was the father of modern sociology. The Ancient City was a groundbreaking work in many regards, principal among them being the reliance upon no secondary sources for his information. Coulanges insisted on going to the original sources. That's one of the problems a lot of people would run into in reading his book. The footnotes and much of the text is in the original Greek and Latin.
Okay, that was some guy on YouTube who's really interested in talking about fustel de coulanges in his really, really boring voice. But if you caught some of the details, there's a lot about his life in that little video. But I can tell you a little bit more about his beliefs and his mission in life. But first off, I want to start with who is Fustel de Coulanges. His full name was Numa Dennis Fustel de Coulanges. Numa Dennis de Numa Dennis Fustel de Coulanges. He's born March 18th, 1830, and he died September 12th, 1889. And he was a revolutionary French historian. He was born in Paris of Breton descent, and after studying at the École Normale Supérieure, he was sent to the French school at Athens in 1853, where he directed some excavations in Chios and wrote an historical account of the island. After his return from Chios, he filled various educational offices and took his doctor's degree with two of these. He wrote Quid veste cultus in institutus veterum privatus publics valuerut and Polybe. In these works, his distinctive qualities were already revealed, and these were his first works. His minute knowledge of the language of Greek and Roman institution, coupled with his low estimate of the conclusions of contemporary scholars, led him to go directly to the original text, which he read without political or religious bias. So that was who is Fustel de Coulanges, but he also accomplished several things in his lifetime. He is known as the inventor of the scientific approach to the study of history in France. And he also gave precedent to how to write history accurately and without political motives and impartiality that can make the history become false. He also had some very powerful theories on how to write history, but I'll get to those later. He his two Fustel's greatest works were Le Cite Antique, which translates to the ancient city, and the Histoire des institutions politiques de l'ancienne France, which is basically a history book, one of the most accurate historical books of France's history. As for Fustel's mission in life, it's really just connected to his belief and his philosophy, which are his two major opinions. Um, the first is complete objectivity by the author is necessary for accurate history, and that secondary sources are usually unreliable. More into this, secondary sources are considered to be secondhand opinions on what actually happened. It's like writing a biography on George Washington. It's not really George Washington's direct words, but it's the events of his life from the author's view. Since it's from the author's point of view, the biography has a high likelihood that the author's political, economic, religious, and social views will be added in. This wouldn't be as accurate as if you could talk to George Washington directly. So the history would be less accurate if you use the secondary sources rather than going straight to the main sources, like Fustel de Coulanges believed. Um, Complete objectivity goes hand in hand with the unreliability of secondary sources, only instead of referring to the source, it refers to the author. The author must write an unbiased account of history to create an accurate depiction of what really happened. A lot of people in Fustel de Coulanges' lifetime were changing the history to their own political ambitions. This fueled Fustel to build his theory on the complete objectivity required in writing history and the unreliability of secondary sources. When related to the jungle and Fustel de Coulanges, there's nothing really to compare about them. It's mostly contrasting because both of them, yeah, both Upton Sinclair and Fustel de Coulanges wrote books, but Fustel wrote for different reasons than Upton Sinclair. Like Fustel de Coulanges wrote simply to inform of history and not really to change anything. And Upton Sinclair wrote with political ambitions to change the meatpacking plants and change the country. And this is something Fustel really, he wouldn't look at Upton Sinclair's book as being historically accurate because it's only from one point of view. And Fustel de Coulanges stressed using many points of view to get the accurate story. This brings us to Fustel's quote, which is, "Do not applaud me. It is not I who speaks to you, but history which speaks through my mouth." This quote may be just two small sentences, but it really sums up all his theories. To paraphrase that quote, it's really saying an author of history must simply allow the events to flow out of him without any bias or ambition, so that the author is almost unimportant except for simply telling the history. This quote can be related to the jungle, but it discredits Upton Sinclair rather than supporting him, because by Fustel de Coulanges standards, the book would be considered inaccurate, like I said before, because Upton Sinclair's bias is added to the story. But he would be happy that Upton Sinclair did use primary sources by doing the research himself. But it came down to Upton wrote it for political change, so it cannot be considered completely historical.